Welcome to the Red Sneaker Writers Podcast. News, interviews, and writing tips for people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them achieve it. Your host is the nationally best-selling author of more than 50 books, William Bernhardt.
Hello, Red Sneaker Writers. This is episode 54, going out on September 21st, 2020. Well, this is our first podcast post-WriterCon, WriterCon 2020, our annual writers conference. So I just want to send out a big thank you to all the many people who participated, either in front of the podium or behind it, helping make this conference a success. And that includes those of you who either came or watched the conference on your computers through the streaming aspect that we added this year. We actually managed to see a 20% increase in our attendance this year, despite the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic lockdown. I think that's a testament to you, the writing community, those of you who are writers and emerging writers, and the seriousness of your devotion to language and the writing arts. In case you're wondering, yes, of course, we're having another conference next year. We're already planning for WriterCon 2021, and this I know for certain, we will retain the streaming aspect, plus the ability to watch all the sessions after the conference online. I know many of you who listen to this podcast are in far-flung places, at least far-flung from me, and Oklahoma City, where the conference takes place. So this will enable you to be an important part of the conference, to benefit from all the aspects of the conference, despite your geographical location. I'll convey more information about WriterCon 2021 when I have it, but rest assured, we will have it and we will stream. On this podcast, my special guest interview is with Betsey Kulakowski, who has just published her first novel, The Veritas Codex. It's the first book in a series involving an investigative television journalist who explores the strange side of things. I had the pleasure of meeting Betsey on the WriterCon cruise and couldn't be more excited to see her first book now in print. So I wanted to talk to her about that, about the process of writing and publishing and what it's like having your first book come out during the middle of a worldwide lockdown. We'll talk to Betsey, we'll have writing tips, but first, the news. A lot of interesting news coming out of the world of traditional publishing, and some from the world of online book sales and book reading, and even artificial intelligence. First up, I've reported before that Simon & Schuster was on the market, available to any of you with a spare $1.2 billion. I also reported that Penguin Random House looked like a very likely buyer, and in the past couple weeks, the CEO of Burleigh, the parent company of Penguin Random House, has confirmed that they are looking pretty seriously at this acquisition and presumably are in the negotiation process. The CEO said that the publishing business model is, quote, robust, the business resilient and profitable. It's a good cultural fit, end quote. He seems to be commenting not only on the intelligence of this acquisition for the company that is already the largest publishing entity in the English-speaking world, but also seems to be voicing some confidence that there is a future for traditional or print-based publishing. They've done this before, so if anybody can bring it off, they would be the one. Interestingly enough, the CEO also went on to say that he thinks there's going to be more consolidation once this pandemic is past. Of course, we're all wondering when that is going to be. But the point seems to be that when so many are being hard hit, particularly in terms of print-based sales, there might be more companies up on the market. After the Big Five becomes Big Four, could it be 3, 2, one, and then where do we go from there? It's also interesting that we're talking about this consolidation after a period that has not been the best ever for Penguin Random House. They reported a sales decline of 1.4% for the first half of the year as composed to the previous year, and also profits down of nearly 8%. Now, digital sales have increased, ebooks, digital downloads of audiobooks, but everything else not so much. The one shining star in the Penguin Random House arsenal is a book you've heard me mention before, Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, is still doing extremely well for them and is still their best-selling fiction title. Speaking of traditional publishing and book selling, we've heard from the CEO of the largest chain bookstore in the United States, and really the only national bookstore chain at this point, Barnes & Noble. Their relatively new CEO, James Daunt, spoke in an online seminar hosted by Book Industry Study Group. A lot of what he said was kind of old news, stuff he's been saying for at least a year, but we haven't seen happen yet. To be fair, bookstores have been closed for a good part of this year. He says he wants more input from local bookstores on what books they should stock. He's taking various measures to try and reduce returns. The bookstores need or obligation to return books for credit to the book publisher. If they don't sell the book after a certain period of time, they can return the book to the publishing house for credit, but it's a burdensome and waste-filled process. Anyway, what I found most interesting was this quote from Daunt, so listen to what he's saying. Bookstores do have to justify themselves, and I don't think we have any God-given right to exist. If we are not inspiring within our communities and able to attract customers to us, frankly, we will not exist. How is it that bookstores do justify themselves in the age of Amazon? They do so by being places in which you discover books with an enjoyment, with a pleasure, with a serendipity that is simply impossible to replicate online. End quote. Well, I hope you were able to grasp what he's saying. Even I should have done a British accent because, it's James Daunt. But even without that, isn't that pretty honest? I mean, he's acknowledging that there are simpler and probably cheaper and certainly quicker ways to buy books than traveling to the local Barnes & Noble. If the chain's going to exist, it's going to be because people want to go there, and not just because they like the feel of the book and they want to hold it in their hands. It has to be a destination, a pleasure place that people want to go to discover books, because there are other ways to discover and purchase books. I thought that was astoundingly honest. What he didn't explain, of course, is how he's going to create that pleasurable environment that people want to go to. Semi-related to the world of bookstores would be the world of libraries, and we had statements from David Burleigh from OverDrive, OverDrive being a company that distributes ebooks and audiobooks, digital audiobooks, not, object-based audiobooks, to primarily libraries. And he provided some pretty useful, interesting statistics showing that library activity has, in fact, increased since the onset of the pandemic. Of course, they had obstacles, too, as many libraries were closed, but in fact, the number of new users added each week went up after initial delay when everything was in immediate lockdown and people didn't know what to do. But since late March, early April, their borrows have been ahead of pre-pandemic numbers. And even to this point, many more than 6 months after the lockdown began for most people, checkouts are still trending about 60% above last year. Ebook checkouts have greatly increased and still remain high as opposed to last year. In other words, people are still reading, and not just because they have to, or they don't have to go to work or work the same hours. They're choosing to. But many people who were opposed to ebooks before are finding they're not so bad as they thought they were once upon a time. The world is changing. he also mentioned that publishers are now making more room for direct-to-the-customer marketing. In other words, instead of spending all their money advertising related to bookstores, co-op or product placement ads so that they can get their books into bookstores and get them displayed at the bookstores, but instead marketing direct to the customer, understanding that people don't necessarily have to have a bookstore in order to order books. So you see how these stories go hand in hand. Daunt is right. He understands that people can skip the bookstore and still enjoy their reading habit. So he's got to find a way to make people want to go there, so publishers will continue to send their advertising theirs that way instead of going with the direct-to-customer marketing. One last story. This will be of interest to certainly techies and maybe everything, and this relates to a new program called Marlowe. Marlowe as in the poet or the detective, depending upon which way you go. Marlowe. It's an artificial intelligence program that will basically analyze your unpublished novel for a relatively small fee. A few years ago, a book came out. I think this was before I did the podcast, but I remember talking about it to other venues at the time. It was called The Bestseller Code by Jody Archer and Matthew Jockers. And this book purported to have done computer analysis on hundreds, if not thousands, of best-selling books to try and figure out what's the secret? How do you make a bestseller? And the thesis of the book was that there was, quote, an uncanny number of latent features that recur over and over again in best-selling books. And so the authors divined basically what I think now we would call an algorithm to read bestsellers and figure out what is the DNA of a bestseller so that you can break it down and understand it and presumably put it in your next book. Well, that algorithm has now been integrated into Marlowe, this brand new for-profit service that you can find at a website called Authors AI. One of the founders is Matthew Jockers, who is one of the authors of that previously mentioned books. Basically, anybody now, for a fee, can upload their novel manuscript, their unpublished work, and receive this algorithm-based analysis of their work, analyzing your dialogue or your balance between dialogue and narrative, or your characterization, narrative beats, pacing, the plot structure. And you may be wondering, wait a minute, characterization, how is a computer going to measure that? And that is a darn good question, but they have ways. If you'd like to see this in action, visit Jane Friedman's website, because she submitted 2 books to the service, and you can read the reports they got on her website. What's interesting is it's mostly all these charts and graphs, ups and down loops showing where the plot supposedly gets more exciting or more boring, or where the character's journey ebbs and flows, and stuff that, frankly, I didn't find very illuminating. It's the sort of thing a computer programmer might enjoy, but I'm not sure how much an author will. They also have lists of thematic or structural elements that recur in the back, percentage-wise, like there's a lot of this, there's not so much of that. If you'd like to check out and find out what a computer programmed by these guys thinks of your book, you can do that. Apparently so far, before they even opened, Marlowe, the program, read almost 1,000 titles in order to build its database of information. And now they are offering a free report to you. Yes, you Red Sneaker writers or anybody else who wants to do this. It's not as detailed as the report you get if you pay money, but the free report will focus on things like, are you using cliches or too much dialogue or overusing adjectives and adverbs. It's sort of a plussed AI version of Grammarly, I suppose. Misspellings and other kind of surface level problems that might arise. I'm reporting this as a news item. I will point out it's not a recommendation. It's way too soon